thank you all for joining us this evening. It's great to see lots of faces. And Kristin, thank you for being here. Welcome. And I'm a huge fan of what you're doing at IREX, and just really thrilled to be here and to dig in on this topic that is so important. So let's begin by discussing just the dangerous spread of disinformation and how IREX is working to inoculate individuals against it. So I'm going to start globally. When I think about IREX and your work in over 120 countries and serving over 12 million people, I think about the fact that many of the people you serve live in very fragile democracies. So can you help us understand how disinformation elsewhere around the world differs from some of the problems we deal with here in the United States?
Mm-hmm. And thank you, Karen, for being here tonight. And I just want to take a moment to thank Megan and everyone at the World Affairs Council and all of you for being here. I think this is a really important issue, and I'm glad you're all taking the time to discuss it. To answer your question, I'll talk first about the ways that I think the disinformation, fake news, whatever you want to call it, threat around the world differs from the US. But I also want to come back to how it's actually very similar, how a lot of us around the world have a very, very similar set of challenges we're coping with. So some of the ways the threats are different in other environments is, first of all, many countries don't enjoy the same kind of decades and centuries of democratic history and norms that we have in this country. Less tolerance, they may have more violence, less well-developed institutions. So the context is even more volatile. And also, there is some research suggesting that more educated populations are less susceptible to fake news and disinformation. We're all still susceptible, by the way, so we can't get complacent, but education does have an impact. So when you're dealing with more fragile democracies, less developed institutions, more polarized, violent societies with less tolerance, you definitely, less education, you definitely are going to see some differences and more exacerbated threats. Another thing is when information technology and the internet is very new and people don't understand how it works. I mean, some analysts have suggested that fake news about the Rohingya in Myanmar spread even faster because people didn't really, they had a certain kind of Facebook access. They didn't know to look for other information on the internet. People weren't as critical consumers of information on the internet as, say, my son is or his counterparts are. So that's the way they're different. That said, I really want to stress how global this problem is. IREX, my organization, works around the world. We also work a bit in the United States. And just everywhere, people are confronting fake news, disinformation, misinformation, overwhelmed with volumes of information. Some of it is intentionally manipulated. Some of it is unintentionally spread. It's a threat to national security. It's a threat to democracy. It's a threat to free elections. It's a threat to public health when information about diseases is spread. It's a threat to economic development. So it's just a really multi-dimensional complex threat. And one of the reasons is we all have the same human brains. And our brains are actually wired in ways that make us want to share this information. So part of a media literacy curriculum is not just things like fact-checking and cross-checking news or recognizing altered images. It's about recognizing your own emotional reactions. And we are wired, our brains are wired, that when we have an emotional reaction or a fearful reaction, we are way more likely to share that information than we are to something we don't have that reaction to. So I think the data show that, and you probably remember this better than I do, Karen, people are much more likely to share fake news stories than they are to share corrections.
Yes.
Why is that? Because back in the day when people were yelling, lion, run, climb a tree, they were programmed to share that and to react emotionally. And then when it's just a puppy, you don't feel so inclined to share that because you're not having that same reaction. And when scientists look at how our brains react to to these kinds of emotive, fear-generating, emotion-generating stories, it actually lights up the same parts of our brain as when there is a threat. And so part of what all of this is we have to recognize why we all have this threat around the world is that we all have these brains that are reacting not just to threats, the kind of threats we used to have millennia ago, but also on social media and on the internet.
Right. And it's interesting because it's the same phenomenon that psychologists note when they talk about gossip, because gossip is a way for us as humans to check out like whether or not you feel the same way I feel about what she's wearing or what they said or whatever. So that's one of the ways that we can establish social norms, and we work in society to do that. And so it just gets accelerated online. Right.
And apparently, I just read a book about this. We evolved to gossip because sharing information is a way to sort of get an edge and to survive. And we're very social creatures, so we engage with other people. And like you said, social media just amplifies, puts on steroids, this tendency that we've had with us all along.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, I mean, it's clearly a global problem. And a lot of the things that have started or exacerbated the problem have been homegrown here in the United States. So around the world, with the exception of China, I'm sure many of you know that social media is dominated by just a small number of platforms that are owned and operated here in the United States. But our American institutions, our legal system, economic, and political institutions just haven't evolved sufficiently to keep pace with these platforms. So, many solutions right now have been technological, and that's what we're relying on right now. So it's bots fighting bots. So, Kristin, do you think this is working?
I mean, I think the short answer is clearly no. And I think the tech platforms and companies would actually agree, and they're aware. And it's a bit of a debate and a struggle right now about what their role is. I do think they have an important role to play, and I think they're going to have to play more of a role going forward. But I don't think there's a tech solution to this alone, because again, we're talking about human brains and how humans are interfacing with the technology. So I always think of a three-legged stool. And I wish there were a silver bullet to solve this problem, but I really don't believe there is. One leg of the stool is government regulation. I do think we are going to see more government regulation in the information space, and that's challenging for a number of reasons. One is that regulation lags behind reality. It's just slow. And then the other issue is that, people are, especially in democracies, are understandably very nervous about government regulating speech. And there are many, many examples of authoritarian countries around the world, and even not authoritarian countries, using the threat of fake news or disinformation or propaganda or whatever they want to call it to justify clamping down on free expression. And so there's not an easy solution to that. So there's the speed issue, and then there's the issue about human rights and free expression and what is the role of government and political motivation. So that's one leg of the stool, an important part of the stool, but also there are a lot of challenges. There's a technology leg of the stool, so both the tech platforms, but also specific use of algorithms and software and so on to sort of filter, block. There are all kinds of tools developing, can you send someone on social media a message saying, oh, that fake news story you shared has been corrected. Will you share this with your friends? There are all kinds of tweaking the algorithms. There are all kinds of things that are being developed on the platforms and tools, technological tools. And I think that can be part of the solution too. But technology also lags behind because the cost of producing disinformation now is effectively zero. And there are more and more effective tools available to citizens to produce ever more effective disinformation. Whether they intend to produce disinformation or misinformation, they can now edit video clips to make it look like someone's mouth is saying something with their own voice that they did not actually say. There are deep fakes. It's just getting incredibly sophisticated to produce. And so even the tech platforms, again, trying to have free expression and an open platform. I mean, these are platforms designed to enhance communication, so they lag behind. There are always ways to get around them, and especially when the cost of doing so is zero. And the other thing is, there is a business interest. I mean, these are companies, and their job is to help people communicate. And the more information that spreads, the more it supports their bottom line and what they're trying to do. They have responsibilities to their shareholders. And then there are some legitimate questions about what they can and can't do. So I think that they can do more. I think that government can do more, but I don't see how governments or tech companies or tech solutions can be the solution. The third leg of the stool, I think, when producing disinformation costs nothing and is easy, and you can have incredibly wide reach, I think you have to work on the citizen side. You have to work on the information consumer side. And we see evidence that it can work. You know, Finland has become very sophisticated. It's probably the most advanced country in the world. They have public service campaigns. They do adult education. They have a national schools curriculum. Sweden is another example. Estonia, Ukraine is quickly on the way to doing this. And so I think there are models showing that some promise that we can help inoculate citizens, make them more resilient to disinformation. But it does take some effort. And of all the legs of the stool, this is the area where I see the least being done. And so that's actually what motivated me to give this talk. I also was speaking at Stanford yesterday because I would like many more people to focus on the citizen side of the equation, do more research, fund more solutions, because right now there are people working on this, but they're very isolated, they're very small, and it's not even beginning to approach the scale of the problem.
Absolutely.
So that's what our curriculum does, is it works on that. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, we think about some of the countries you mentioned. I know, for instance, in Ukraine, there are some of the very people who are working on what I'd call the demand side of the attention economy, which is how do we get citizens and individuals to demand quality media and demand the truth as opposed to falling for other stuff.
And actually, do you mind if I interrupt for 1 second?
Yeah, go ahead.
This is an example of a piece of research that needs to be done. We have anecdotal information that if you give people media literacy training, they will actually demand more quality information and pay for it. But it's not actually established empirically. There's no data or research to support that. And there are so many unanswered questions like that aren't being invested in right now. So that's a perfect example of one of them.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, when you're talking about the three legs of the stool, the two legs are all about the supply side of the attention economy and not the demand side. And that's where there really needs to be more work. And we were talking earlier back there about the fact that in our country and some others as well, it's unclear who really owns this problem of disinformation. I know from talking to people in military and defense, they see this as a security risk. Other people see it as health risk. Other people see it as human rights issues. So it's really unclear how that third leg of the school is going to become as strong as the other two. So.
Yeah, and I think other countries do have an advantage over the U.S. in this respect. One is they're smaller. Most countries in the world are smaller than the United States, and it's easier to deal with this when you have a smaller, more homogeneous population. It is also easier to deal with if you have a single source of information threat. So in Europe, the Swedens, the Finlands, the Estonias of the world, Ukraine, they're really worried about Russian propaganda. They may have many dimensions to the threat, but there's sort of a single external perpetrator that they are most concerned about, which helps to organize.
And they have a legacy or history of having to deal with that kind of propaganda on their soil from many years of war and other things in the past. The United States really has never had like an information invasion until now at this kind of scale.
That's correct. And the other thing is they also have different kinds of government structures to deal with it. So we don't have a centralized education ministry in this country. We have 50 different state education departments that really exercise control over the curriculum, which means that, when IREX works with the Ministry of Education in Ukraine, in a very short amount of time, we've already had our curriculum in 650 schools and in pre-service teacher training, and it's much easier because there's a centralized curriculum. You can debate the pros and cons of having centralized or decentralized education policy. Regardless of where you come down on that, the fact remains that if there is something like this that you want to do quickly at a national level, it is just easier and more expedient if you have a national level curriculum. And so I think that is yet another reason why it will be harder in a country like the United States than it is in a Ukraine or a Finland or an Estonia.
Right. So my next question is about how IREX really combats the different types of misinformation. So, today the problem encompasses everything from, funny memes that seem harmless that our teenagers share to hate speech that really divides us and divides people to, clearly like threats and dangers that cost lives. So, could you share with us about how Learn and Discern helps people make sense of the underlying motives behind the different types of misinformation that they're exposed to and what's working?
Absolutely. And as Karen said, our curriculum is called Learn to Discern. That's sort of the brand name we've put on it. And a lot of it is aimed at young people, but I want to point out a lot of it is actually aimed at older adults as well. So working through public libraries, public service announcements, online courses. Great Courses just hired IREX. So any of you can go on the Great Courses site tonight and download a course on media literacy. And so there is the older demographic, and just in the US alone, Americans 65 and older are 7 times more likely to forward fake news than their younger counterparts. That's actually a pattern that replicates in different countries as well, where it's been studied. But young people are not immune either. And so let me just talk about the components of the curriculum, because I think that helps to get at the different types of disinformation, and also what do you actually teach people? I mean, some of it is basic news consumption and critical thinking. How do I fact check? How do I cross check? How do I, recognize not just false news, but also doctored images and videos, which are becoming increasingly easy to produce. But honestly, fact checking alone is completely inadequate, and there are some mixed studies about how much impact it really has on people's behavior. So the other thing we found that really makes a difference is, one, helping people understand how their own brains work. When we see the same thing a lot, our brains are wired to think that be more likely to think it's true, even if it's not. We have confirmation bias. If it confirms something that we already believe, we plug it into our existing mental framework. This issue about an emotional reaction, if you actually make people aware of that and how our brains work, people can actually modulate themselves. We can say, oh, wait a second, before I share this, I think I ought to take a deep breath here and recognize that I'm having an emotional reaction, not an intellectual reaction. And I wanted to share this. There's a 2016 study that showed that 59% of links posted on social media have never been clicked on by the people who posted them.
Yeah.
Right? So that what that's showing is that people are seeing a headline, they're just forwarding it, and they're not taking a minute to react. So making people aware of that, and also giving them a sense of responsibility. You can control information. You have a responsibility to look. That's another part of the curriculum. And then another really important part of the curriculum is helping people recognize who owns different media outlets. This is particularly important in different parts of the world: Serbia, Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova. Who owns the outlets can have very important consequences for the news coverage. And so we never tell people what to believe. We teach people how to think about what the information they consume, and just asking questions and knowing who owns media outlets, or asking questions. Why is this showing up in my media feed? Why have I been targeted? Why am I being micro-targeted? Knowing that there is a thing called micro-targeting, it does actually change people's behavior. And we have some demonstrated results from our programs I'd be happy to talk about, but I also don't want to talk too long at any given time. I'll pause.
This is great. I'm super excited to hear that you're taking what I call like a social emotional learning approach to helping people recognize their vulnerabilities really against this danger, right? So, there's negativity bias, which is another, you described confirmation bias. There's also negativity bias. There's really, fortunately, in a lot of places, a focus on helping people understand science of mind. And so, maybe there's an opportunity going forward to pull together the SEL and the, disinformation communities together to partner and grow in that way. I also really love your focus on critical thinking, and I believe there's an opportunity to help people think in what we call at SOAP contextual thinking, putting the issue of, say, climate change in context with what's going on politically, economically, scientifically. Being able to see issues in multiple contexts is really important. And then the media ownership thing that you talked about, I thought is critical. I know that a lot of young people feel like they don't want to be fooled, right? And so they don't want to know. They want to know that whoever's behind the message they're reading, like that if they don't agree with that person, they'd like that owner, that body, they want to know their source. So I think it's awesome that you guys are doing that work. So my next question is actually about young people. And, I know that when I talk to our interns, where do you get your news? They really can't answer. I think I read something about 25% of people in the United States anyway can't name a media source that they consider to be objective. So today our young people live in a world where they say, news finds me. They just get it from late night TV or social media, all kinds of different sources. So could you talk a little bit more about what you see that does and doesn't work when you're trying to teach people about media and what they need to watch out for?
Yeah, I think one of the things we've learned, just to reiterate a point I made, is just teaching people to fact check. It's just not enough. And part of it is that people don't do it. It's still easy to be fooled. It's important, don't get me wrong, but you also have to recognize this emotional context that people are operating in. And so that's a big part of it.
Yeah, I think if I could interrupt on that, sure. I remember that when a lot of the disinformation problems started to arise, Facebook actually introduced like a fact-checking thing within feeds, and people just wouldn't even click on them, right? And it's just so simple. So if they're not doing that, they're definitely not going to a fact-checking site like Snopes or other things. It's just there's just not that sort of demand in the attention economy for that sort of information.
And you're not going to fact check everything you read. So it's good to know that those tools are out there. So if you really have a question, I have resources and I can go to them. So I do think it is important. And also just trying to create a habit that you cross-check news. You're not just reading one source. But I think also what's important is to give young people in particular a sense that they can exercise some control over their own information consumption. Because what we find is young people are actually very overwhelmed. Older people are very overwhelmed. And so giving them a sense that they have a greater sense of control about how not only what they see, but how they respond to it, taking ownership is really important. So let me give you a few statistics. So in Jordan, where we've done this work with young people, relative to a control group, so when we actually do, take young people who have have gone through our training program and young people from a similar demographic who have not, we see they're 44% better able to identify and analyze false and manipulative information. 14% have a greater percent of control, 14% greater sense of control over how they respond to the information, which gets to that point, and 78% more knowledgeable about the news media industry. So how do they put it in context? And in Ukraine, we find that students, an evaluation of students based on an independent test, not self-reporting, students were twice as likely to detect hate speech, 18% better at identifying fake news stories, and I think there was one other statistic I was going to mention. 13% more likely to say they believe critical information consumption skills are useful in life. So part of it is just like building these habits, building this awareness, building this sense of control so that they don't just feel like they're powerless in the face of all of this information, and they can make choices and habits that will have an impact. I think the other thing we really want to do is change behavior. So even if you're not going to change mass minds so that everybody is fact checking every single article they're looking at, fine. I don't fact check every article I read. But, can you at least ask people not to share information? Can you develop a norm? Like if you haven't read it, if you haven't checked it, can you please not share it with everybody you know? That is, that's a social norm. I mean, I don't sneeze into my hand and shake someone's hand. I sneeze into my elbow, and I don't do that because we're taught it's a social norm that you don't do that. So why would you give polluted information or junk information? Why would you infect your friends with that kind of information? And actually, we're doing some interesting work in Ukraine and Georgia with public service announcements just to sort of try and test out whether you can change that norm about sharing. Again, you're not telling people what to believe. You're not telling them what to read. It's just, think critically about what you're doing and maybe don't share it until you feel more confident that it's true. And I think if there's a social norm where people would be embarrassed that, oh, I'm so sorry, Karen, you're my friend, and here I sent you misleading information. I think if people felt that way, instead of getting the dopamine squirt because they saw the people retweeting and liking that false image or video that they sent, that would actually, we're social creatures. I think that would change people's behavior fairly quickly. And we have already seen there's a huge difference between the behavior of older people and younger people, because our children have already adopted more of these behaviors than our parents did, and I think that they're not immune either. And by the way, there's a pretty shocking study about Stanford students and fake news, and so we could get really a little overly patting ourselves on the back about well-educated, sophisticated young information consumers. We're all at risk, but it is a skill that you can learn, and behaviors learn.
Okay, so I know that you're going to say that like the Berkeley students didn't fall for fake news.
I have a Cal student. I have a Cal student for a son.
So we were talking about that earlier. But I know from some of the research we've worked on, is like people would say things like, it was so embarrassing when I fell for fake news. So it wasn't so much like, part of being a responsible citizen is to be informed. We'd love it if everybody said that, right? That would be great. But in reality, it is more about some of the social pressures that could affect a change in behavior, where people say, that's embarrassing, or it's just not cool to not know what I'm actually talking about, right?
But that's not the norm right now. Now it's the dopamine squirt in your brain from getting people to share. And guess what people share? People share things that get an emotional response, that are evocative, that are outrageous, that have a strong point of view. And so that's the kind of thing where we need to somehow learn to modulate ourselves and our own reactions, or we'll never get out of this. But like I said, it doesn't mean that you can't be entertained anymore, but maybe you can be more critical about what you actually believe, and then also what you propagate out there in the world and how you frame it, that is it true or not, or you've checked it, or what have you.
Well, I want to make sure we have enough time for audience questions, so this will be my last one. And I'm hoping you can leave us with a sense of hope for the future. Like, how can we save ourselves from our, brains that need these dopamine hits, and what can we do as a society that could help really inoculate individuals from the disinformation and misinformation problem that we see?
Well, I am a habitual optimist. However, I do actually not want to underestimate the scale of the challenge. And the technology is evolving in ways where deep fakes and the very low-cost tools are available to make the false images even more sophisticated, fake news more sophisticated, artificial intelligence that will make it easier and easier to have false personas propagating fake information and creating accounts. There's also more and more use of private and encrypted chats in WhatsApp and Facebook. And so I really don't want to underestimate the scale of the problem. However, this is doable. There are models like Sweden, like Ukraine, like Finland, like Estonia, where national governments take this seriously. We could work with the tech platforms. We could work at the government level. We find that working in public libraries and schools, online courses, people take them. They're interested. They want it. We just did an experiment working with coffee shops and online courses in Ukraine, and we actually had a 25% completion rate for an online course with random people who came into coffee shops. I don't know if you all follow online courses and MOOCs, but that's a huge completion rate. And so it shows that people are interested, and we know that there are success stories. We have data showing that this works. We have some data on our website, www.irex.org, that shows that even a year after a very low-cost training, that people show sustained behavior change. So this is doable, but it does take, first of all, we really need much more commitment. We have to care. We really have to work at scale. This is one of the challenges, and nobody knows how much scale we need to work at to make a difference at this point. We need to reach different demographic groups. It's not just young people. And we can't just focus on the school system, because those people aren't going to vote for really long times. And, they're all the rest of us who do vote. Mm-hmm. And so, we have to work with different demographic groups who get information in different ways. I think we have to keep it apolitical. There are, one of the reasons why elites are perpetrators of disinformation in many circumstances, in many countries around the world, there are countless examples, is that sometimes it benefits them. And so, if it becomes political, then it gets very difficult. And, you somehow have to navigate and treat this like civics education, like a part of civic engagement. Civics education is kind of out of fashion in this country. But, I think in countries that do take civics education really seriously and civic engagement seriously, media and information literacy becomes really part of that. And then there's the issue of staying agile, because the threat keeps evolving and becoming more sophisticated, so we have to become more agile and sophisticated. Right. But if we do have these kinds of holistic strategies with governments, with tech companies, using tech tools, but also working on the citizen and education side, I actually do think we can move the needle. One thing I'll close with, though, is we actually know shockingly little about this part of the equation. There are a lot of resources, a lot of attention, a lot of research going into algorithms and public policy and issues like this, but the commensurate investment in citizen resilience is just not there. We don't know how many people in a society would need these improved skills to make a difference. I don't know. Nobody has it. What techniques are most important, are most influential to teach media literacy? What changes behavior that really matters? We don't know. The research is not there. I could go on and on and on. That's why I was pitching Stanford yesterday. You guys need to get on the case. But we really need minds working on this, and we need to be testing out different tools and seeing what works in a very, very quick, iterative fashion. It's actually not very expensive, I have to tell you. The kinds of training we do cost, dimes or quarters or dollars. It doesn't cost hundreds or thousands. And so this is doable, but we just need to take it much more seriously. And again, we have to have to value the citizen side of the equation as much as we do the public policy and the technology side. And then I think we can make a difference.
Great. Thank you very much, Kristin.
Thank you, Karen.
I'm going to read a couple of the questions for the audience. Thank you so much, folks, for submitting your questions to me in writing. So two different people asked a very similar question. So how does confirmation bias play into the use and spread of fake news? How do you identify your own biases when reading potentially false news? And similar kind of question, will people just examine stories they disagree with? Does your training address overcoming confirmation bias?
Yeah, so confirmation bias is basically if we already believe something, we're much more likely to gravitate towards information that fits into that existing mental mindset. Our brains don't like to, our brains aren't wired to want to change their minds all the time. And there's a good reason for that. It would be just hard to get through our day if we had to completely reevaluate every interaction we had or everything we know all the time, all day, every day. We'd never get anything done. We'd be overwhelmed. And so we do have this tendency to do it. You know, I think there is something in our training and in lots of media literacy training that does help to deal with that. It's trying just to encourage people to look at different sources, to do that as a habit. And although I think it's unrealistic to think for every single piece of information you consume, you're going to actively go out and find all the different perspectives that exist in the world. Just habituating people to that is important. And another thing is also, once we understand, I think one of the most impactful parts of our training is helping people understand how our brains work. When we know that there is such a thing as confirmation bias, that we're alert to the fact that, oh, we do this. We're human and we do this. Then you can maybe recognize, oh, maybe I ought to be extra careful and making sure that I'm not seeing this information and just reconfirming something I already believe. Maybe I better be paying attention to those other views. So I think it's a habit we can form to look at and listen to others and then and other perspectives. And also then that recognition about, I really better do this because everything in my brain wants me to do the opposite, and I won't be a good information consumer, and I won't be making good decisions if I am not alert to my own tendencies.
Great, thanks. Another question is, what can we or our governments do when large platforms like Facebook are not as cooperative in combating disinformation?
I mean, democratic governments around the world can change the rules or legislate. Now, there are a lot of challenges with that and reasons why that is hard or politically painful, and especially one of the challenges getting into this issue of free expression and regulating free expression. It's actually not easy, and I know Mark Zuckerberg took a lot of flack for saying that he doesn't want to be the arbiter of truth, and people said, oh, but you're the arbiter of disinformation all the time. But there is a real issue there. That I think, it is fair to acknowledge that it's not like it's so easy. There are things that the tech platforms can do. At first they said, oh, we can't detect child pornography, we can't detect terrorist messaging. And actually, they've been very innovative in developing ways, human and technological, artificial intelligence, in order to do that. So, one has hope that they could actually address this too. But I also do think there are things about this that are legitimately hard, and we can't act like the tech platforms have a magic solution that will address this. And also, they are companies. They do have shareholders. They do have responsibilities to their shareholders. And right now, their business model is that we all get to use them for free in return for sharing lots of stuff on them. And so the companies are in a position where, unless there are laws and regulations about what they can and can't do, it is reasonable for them to expect within certain limits to satisfy their shareholders and follow their business model, and all of their users that are misusing it in some ways. And I understand why they don't want to be held completely responsible. But I think the tides are turning in many societies, not just the United States, where we're saying, you have become so powerful that now there is a growing societal expectation that you will be playing a greater role. And I actually think you're starting to see the technology companies coming to terms with that expectation. The conversations, I'm not defending, I'm not making any arguments. I'm just saying from an empirical observation where the tech companies were 2 years ago on this issue and even where they are now, there is actually a difference because I think they are just recognizing that they can't not play this role.
Right.
And frankly, they have had some success in some of these other areas like child pornography and terrorist messaging and so on. So it shows that when they want to, they can do some
make
things.
A difference.
You can make a difference.
And I think, unfortunately, for quite a long time, they didn't really have as much incentive to try to make some of the changes that they have. So the EU has pressed the platforms a lot harder than any other government body around the world. But unfortunately, even some of the EU's regulations have had unintended consequences, which I could go into some more detail if anybody wants to talk about afterwards. But there's a lot of things that make it very difficult to regulate these major platforms, and so they are starting to fear that they could end up being regulated like public utilities, and that I think is something to answer the audience members' question, like what can we or our governments do? Stay tuned in on the issue of our social media platforms, public utilities, and what are your thoughts on that, and contribute to that discussion, I would say. Okay, another question is, Wikipedia is not perfect, but it is very good at removing fake info through its structure and its screeners. What is your hope and concerns about Wikipedia, and does it need any improvements?
Well, I wouldn't consider myself an expert on Wikipedia. I think Wikipedia is actually quite an amazing example of human cooperation. It's incredible. When was the last time you went on a Wikipedia page and it hadn't been updated in the last 2 weeks? I mean, you can pick anything. It's remarkable. So I don't want to critique Wikipedia. I don't feel like I know enough, but it is sort of I hadn't really thought about Wikipedia as an example of crowdsourcing fact-checking. It is one of the most stunning human accomplishments in terms of collective information curation that has ever existed on the planet. And so, how could we learn from Wikipedia on this to deal with this issue of disinformation? I actually have never thought about it before now, but I think it's kind of an intriguing prospect. So maybe whoever wrote the question can tell me how they think that we could use those lessons. But it's really an amazing accomplishment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And the challenge, I mean, the audience member mentions, what are your concerns about it? I do worry for any site like Wikipedia that the bad actors are going to become more and more sophisticated, and it's going to be harder and harder to discern fake information in Wikipedia where maybe obscure esoteric information gets falsified. But it is, I believe it, I agree, it's a great human achievement. There's probably some excellent lessons to be learned for the platforms by looking more closely at crowdsourced.
Yeah, and I think it also is a great example that people care. Mm-hmm. People care about sharing knowledge. People care. I mean, these are volunteers. People care about people getting access to the truth, and people will collectively organize, Wikipedia shows, in order to do this. So I actually think that's a really hopeful example. It's not maybe directly applicable, but I think it shows that people don't have to have a financial interest at stake or a political interest at stake. People actually do just care about knowledge and truth at some visceral level and will work to protect it under the right conditions. But Wikipedia also has a really fascinating management structure. It's not as free-for-all as it looks on the outside. And so, other people know much more about Wikipedia than me, but I think it shows how human inclinations can be channeled in the right way to protect the truth and access to different perspectives.
Great. This is a question from a social studies teacher who would like to help his students learn how to find reputable internet sources that might rival their instant access to social media. Is there curriculum available or strategies to be used in the classroom? And he notes that he has now learned about Learn and Discern curriculum.
Yeah, so we have information about the Learn to Discern curriculum on our website, IREX.org, and also there are a lot of other tools out there. Common Sense Media has materials for educators out there. A number of different newspapers like The Guardian and BBC have media literacy curricula. So there are actually a lot of quality tools out there that educators can use in their own classrooms, and hopefully, we can keep proliferating access to these tools because teachers really want to use these things. And I think one promising issue I want to call attention to is not always thinking about is this has to be added on top of already full curricula. One of the things that they've done in Ukraine is they have just integrated media literacy, information literacy, and critical thinking across the curriculum in the science classes, in the social studies classes, in the art classes. I observed a class in October where people were examining Soviet-era cartoons and they were basically fake news, trying to promote certain images about certain groups in the society. And the students were analyzing them. So you don't always have to add yet another layer onto the curriculum. You can just integrate it into what you're already teaching. And it actually makes the curricula very engaging for students and very relevant. So there are lots of things that individual teachers can do within their own classrooms, within the curricula that they're already using. And I actually think that that's a Common Sense Media's model, rather than doing what we're doing in some foreign countries, which is to work through the education ministry to change their curriculum.
Right. Yeah. I think we've learned a lot about the important role of the mentor or the teacher who engages the student in media and asking questions and putting maybe historical or scientific information in context of today's issues. So it's exciting that we actually have a social studies teacher in the audience who's engaged in this problem and trying to solve it. So thank you for that. And then one of the questions here is, what are some of the success stories you have seen as a result of IREX's media literacy programs? You have talked about some of it.
Yeah, I did.
If you could share a few more, that would be great.
I think these are the ones where we have the best data. If you come back to me in a few weeks, I'll have more data. But I think, I talked about the schools program, but I also want to talk about how there are programs that we do in public libraries. So for instance, let me just pull this up because this is brand new data that I just got here. But so for instance, we're doing a pilot in the United States, working through public libraries in Arizona and New Jersey. And this is less robust data because it's more self-reported, self-assessed, rather than when we have control groups and much more rigorous testing. But even there, after training that went from 6 to 16 hours, participants showed 34% gains in information literacy self-assessment, 21% improvements in media analysis, 9% gain in media locus of control. So that's sort of, again, this issue of understanding who's producing and who owns the outlets, who's producing the media outlet. And across the scores of media literacy assessment, they had moved to the upper end of the spectrum from where they started. And so that's a relatively small amount of training. And it just shows that these were adults, that people can learn this. It's a skill. It can be learned. It doesn't take that much training. And we have other data that I mentioned on our website that shows even a year and a half after the training, people still maintain the changed behaviors. So it just shows that you can have success, you can change behavior, and it's doable. We just have to want to.
Great. So this question from the audience was, what was the process that you used of coming up with the Learn to Discern curriculum, and what kind of research inputs were used, and how is the curriculum implemented?
So it's kind of an interesting story. IREX is a global education and development organization. We've been around for more than 50 years. We started at Columbia University and then spun out. And we work, as Karen said, in more than 100 countries. We have local staffs in at least 20 countries at any given time. This program actually started in Ukraine more than 4 years ago, and it was a very local innovation by local Ukrainian staff. We were working on a major Gates Foundation-funded program with public libraries across Ukraine in more than 1,000 communities to help libraries become civic engagement hubs during a time when Ukraine was going through a democratic transition, a lot of decentralization reform, and what our team kept hearing in the libraries, what the librarians kept hearing is a lot of citizens just saying, I am overwhelmed with information. I don't know what to believe. There's a lot of propaganda. I don't know what to make of it. And the risk in a situation like that is that people will just pull back and not be engaged citizens at all. I don't know what to believe. And so I'll just completely withdraw. And so they started doing a lot of research on, cognitive and behavior science, information processing, designed these curricula, because we've been working on media and education issues for decades. And so we developed these curricula and we tested them and refined them and informed them with other research. And so that's been the process of design. That was the origin of the curriculum. We then brought them into the school system. We then brought them to other countries. So now we're working in Tunisia and Indonesia and Jordan and Georgia and Moldova and Serbia and Ukraine and the US and so on and so forth. And what we're trying to do in all of these countries is learn. We're trying to learn along the way in a much faster, more iterative way than, frankly, organizations like mine usually do, because we're not funded to do it, but it's so important because of the scale of the problem. So we've made investments to try and have common learning agendas so that we can be learning and changing all the time. So I read you some results. We're proud of our results, but it's not good enough. We just all need to get a lot better at this really, really quickly, because the scale of the problem is so great, and the consequences for our democracies, the cohesion of our societies, for social trust, the consequences are so great. We just really all need to be learning and improving much, much faster. Right. So spread the word.
Yeah. So Kristin, you mentioned control earlier when we were talking about, particularly young people, like giving them control of what they're doing with media. What are other ways to incentivize news consumers against the powerful drivers of fake news? As you mentioned, like the dopamine rush, engagement, et cetera. I think this person's question really gets to, what are some things maybe that we haven't tried yet that you think we should be trying?
I am probably not the best person to answer that, because I am not a media literacy expert like some members of my team. But just to repeat what I said earlier, I think one of the things we've already seen that works is just alerting people to how our own brains work and how we react. Because once you have that awareness, you can observe it in yourself. And then you can take a deep breath and you can take a step back. And that's one of the things we've learned is one of the most effective things that you can do, instead of just preaching about, you need to fact check or check sources, again, important, but it's that awareness raising that seems to be one of the things that makes the biggest difference. But I do want to reiterate, it's not just that I don't know this, it's that there are a lot of questions that nobody knows the answer to because we just don't have the research base. We don't have the data. But this is something that we really need. We need a major investment by foundations and others to help us really understand this problem better. Because none of us, whether IREX or other nonprofits or companies or whatever, we can't solve it if we don't understand what works. Right. But that research base is just not there right now.
Okay. Another question from the audience. Could a fourth leg of the stool, I guess that would be a chair, be the media, the media itself, and how and what stories they choose to share with readers and listeners? So I think this gets to the challenge of the media companies are struggling to survive. Traditional media companies are struggling to survive in this attention economy. Information is free and cheap, and the cost of producing it by bad actors is very cheap. But for the investigative reporters and for the media that really works hard as part of the Fourth Estate, it's expensive still. So anyway, as a stool, the leg of the chair, do you see the media being able to play a more important role in thinking more carefully about the types of headlines they write and the stories that they choose to share with readers and listeners?
Yeah, it's actually a great point that the media can play a role. And the media has a problem right now. If you look at the most recent Edelman Public Trust Barometer data that just came out in January, trust in the media is very low globally. They do surveys of populations in 27 different markets around the world. And although trust is not at its absolute lowest point in the media since they've been doing these surveys, it's pretty close. Trust in the media is really low. And in this latest Edelman Trust Barometer, they had a focus on the U.S., and 82% of Americans expect to read misleading information online about the 2020 election. And when asked the question, when seeing the statement, the media I use are contaminated with untrustworthy information, 57% say yes. I worry about false information or fake news being used as a weapon. 76% say yes. This is in the United States. And so media does have a big role to play. They need to somehow dig out of this hole where people don't trust the media, and it's a problem for them. It's a problem. I mean, these are mostly private businesses, despite some nonprofit models out there. Mostly these are private businesses. They have a business problem, so they have to figure out how to solve that. And there are a lot of things they can do about that, but there are also some things working against them. One of the things working against them is the business models for media. They have fewer and fewer staff in order to do the job. One of the local media are more trusted than national media, but local media also have fewer resources. Journalists are under tremendous pressure to be responding quickly. So when things are breaking on social media, whereas in the old days, journalists would take time and fact check and call sources, they actually don't have time to do that and be out with the story. And so there are a lot of competing pressures here in terms of speed and relevance and getting people's attention and clicks and all of that. But on the other hand, the media institutions actually do have a major trust deficit. One last thing on this is, regardless of anyone's politics, it is a fact that after the president was elected, we did see more subscribers to some of the mainstream media outlets. So subscriptions to the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post actually all went up.
Yeah, membership in
public radio also went up, which was kind of interesting because it showed that at least among some Americans, there was a desire to go to large mainstream media institutions, but there are also major partisan divisions. So Republicans are much more distrusting of the mainstream media than Democrats are, and that's a problem. How do we have a civic dialogue if, a big part of the country doesn't trust the same sources of information as the other part of the country? You don't even have a common fact base. I mean, it's hard to have a democracy in that context. So I do think there are a lot of things that media institutions could do to try and bridge those divides and rebuild trust. But, I also think maybe it's an opportunity for some new media actors to rise out of this if people indeed want to demand quality information where we do have some kind of a shared fact base. And there are some outlets that have better ratings on this than others. Some of the newswire services like Reuters actually have wider support as a news source than things like the New York Times or CNN. Again, you can make your own judgments about that, but that's just a fact based on research right now. But they could play a very important role.
Right. Right, absolutely. So we have time for just one more question. One of this one I think is quite interesting. How do you teach individuals to differentiate inaccuracies in reporting versus deliberately malicious news or information that's been designed to mislead people?
Yeah, I mean, there's a big difference between misinformation, which is just people get things wrong. People get things wrong all the time, and fact checking and so on can help with that. And then there's disinformation and intentional manipulation with the intent to mislead. And so I think it can be hard as a new information consumer to tell the difference. But being alert to the fact that first of all, there are actors that are actively trying to mislead you or target you, or a lot of times the news is not even fake. It is actually real news, but there is micro-targeting trying to elicit a certain reaction by a population. Right. So, the studies that have come out about Russian disinformation campaigns, some of it is not actually disinformation. It was just about really spreading anti-immigrant stories to people who might already have a predilection to have an anti-immigrant bias, or spreading stories about, gun control measures. Yeah. To people who are really fearful that their rights are, in their view, their rights are going to be taken away. It's about just stirring the pot and fomenting. So I just want to point out that it's not even always that people are sending fake news. Or completely fake information. It can be, how do you recognize when someone is actively trying to manipulate my view, even with truthful stories. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, which isn't the same as being lied to, but someone is trying to turn the dial up beyond what you would have had as a normal situation going through your life. It is an intentional escalation of the environment and the emotional level with a specific intent to have some kind of desired result.
Fear, usually, right?
Yeah, fear or a political reaction of some sort, or, some actors want a certain result, and others just want to sow discord and division and polarization, because if the United States is weak and we just turn in on ourselves, well, it saves people who may not want a strong United States. It just saves them a lot of trouble. We'll just all turn on each other, and that's just one of the more efficient strategies you could possibly have if you wanted to inflict harm on America.
Right. Yeah. Well, Kristin, we're out of time, but I wanted to thank you so much for being here today, and thank the audience for joining us for this very provocative and complex subject that clearly is global, but hopefully we have brought to light some of the beacons of hope and some of the good work that organizations like yours are doing. So thanks again for being here, and have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you.